This episode and others like it are made possible by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to help support my channel and get early access to every video, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/secondthought. To the rest of the world, the US is known for a few things: obesity, Disney World, and our massive military. To many countries, the population's only experience with Americans is through violent occupation and imperialism. We operate no fewer than 1,000 military bases, 600 of them overseas, ready to threaten whatever part of the world we see fit. The US spends more money on the military than the next 10 nations combined, and the country has been engaged in conflict in 93% of all the years since its founding. The United States is an exceptionally warlike nation. Those in power try to cast our military actions as defensive, even going so far as to rename the Department of War to the Department of Defense. But the truth of the matter is that war is one of our biggest industries. We sell weapons to some of the most oppressive regimes in the world, including ourselves. We rely on foreign intervention to bolster the economy, plundering resources, leveling cities so we can send in teams of contractors to rebuild them, launching ridiculous propaganda campaigns to condition the US population for another Cold War to maintain our economic stranglehold on the entire planet. The rest of the world, with very few exceptions, despises our military. A growing number of Americans realize that our military action is not defensive, but oppressive. Surely there are better ways to spend the ridiculous sums of money we dump into never-ending war. In this episode, we'll take a look at the US military budget and determine what programs we could fund with just a sliver of that funding. Let's start with some numbers. While we don't yet know the exact defense budget for fiscal year 2022, it's looking like the base budget will be somewhere in the $704 to $708 billion range, roughly the same as the previous years. This is despite the fact that the Democrats want to paint themselves as less warlike than the Republicans, and that progressives have been calling for major cuts to military spending. Of course, in reality, the Democrats are not any less warlike than the Republicans. They've simply rebranded themselves as woke imperialists. So Biden's military budget matching Trump's should not come as a surprise. To keep things simple, let's assume a nice round figure of $700 billion. This massive sum funds a number of different projects: research, development, and procurement of new weapon systems, paying military personnel, operations and maintenance, and, becoming more and more expensive with each administration, paying private contractors to do the military's job without supervision or even much regulation. The Pentagon budget has been trending upwards for years, reportedly due to the desire to keep up with China's increase in spending, which grows by roughly 6.5% each year. Of course, this ignores the fact that we could literally cut our defense budget in half and we'd still be spending $100 billion more per year than China. Just like in the first Cold War, the existence of another economic superpower makes for great propaganda to convince Americans it's a good idea to dump more money into our industrial war machine. Now, $700 billion is a massive figure. It's too big for most of us to even wrap our head around. So let's break it down to a monthly budget. The Pentagon spends roughly $60 billion per month on war and the maintenance of global domination. $60 billion is still a ridiculous sum, but at least it's a slightly smaller number to work with. So, what could we do with just 1 month of the US military budget? We face a huge number of challenges here at home, which is part of the reason it's so infuriating when our tax dollars go towards blowing up innocent people in other countries. We face a homelessness crisis, with over 500,000 Americans without so much as a roof over their heads. And that was before the pandemic and the waves of evictions still looming over millions of families. We have the most expensive colleges and universities in the world. Our students are underperforming compared to other nations, and enter the workforce with tremendous debt, more than any previous generation. We're the only industrialized nation not to offer some kind of universal healthcare, despite being the richest nation on Earth. Instead, our healthcare is the most expensive and least effective among peer nations. Inequality in the US has gotten so bad that life expectancy among the working class is going down, while the rich get richer and their life expectancy continues to trend upwards. Housing has become completely unaffordable to most Americans. There's not a single county in the US where a minimum wage earner can afford a one-bedroom apartment. This is despite the fact that we have a huge surplus of homes. There are currently somewhere around 17 million vacant homes in the US. We keep building them, but no one can afford them. These are just a small sample of the problems average Americans face in their daily lives. So, let's see what we can do with a slice of the war budget. We'll start with homelessness. According to one government report, it would cost $20 billion to end homelessness for good. Not $20 billion per year, a one-time investment of $20 billion. We could end homelessness permanently for 1/3 of 1 month of the US military budget. That sounds like a bargain to me. Why keep indefinitely spending small sums of money that just paper over the problem when we could bite the bullet, drop one last lump sum of money, and completely eradicate the homelessness crisis? The fact that we have so many people without the basic necessity of shelter is a national embarrassment and is in direct contrast with the myth that the US is the greatest nation on earth. If we can't even provide for the most basic needs of our people, what good are we? Frankly, we should put an end to homelessness simply because it's the right thing to do. But since this is America we're talking about, a one-time investment of $20 billion will save us money in the long run. The federal government spends just shy of $3 billion per year on funding programs that address homelessness. A little quick math should tell you that a one-time investment would pay for itself in just 7 years. That's just good business sense. There is absolutely no reason we couldn't end homelessness this year. It would just require a shifting of our priorities, away from violence and oppression abroad towards decency and compassion at home. Let's take another challenge: universal healthcare. It's not uncommon to see Americans saddled with tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical debt. We have the most expensive healthcare in the world by far. On average, our per capita expenditure on healthcare is $11,000, fully twice the comparable country average. Okay, but we get great care for that price, right? Well, not exactly. Among our peer nations, our healthcare metrics are objectively worst in most categories. Among these categories are critical factors like infant mortality and life expectancy at birth. To make matters worse, we are the only developed nation that doesn't provide universal healthcare to our citizens. So, in other wealthy nations, and even many less developed ones, you can walk into a doctor's office or hospital, receive treatment, and walk out without paying a cent. That's all taken care of by reasonable taxes. In the US, we still pay taxes, but that money goes to things like bombs and overthrowing democratically elected governments in the global south. Instead of having our healthcare guaranteed to all, we instead have to shoulder tremendously expensive medical bills, even if we have supposedly good employer-provided healthcare. If you don't have health insurance, good luck. There's a reason so many Americans choose not to get the care they need. It's because they simply can't afford it. Okay, by this point in the year of our Lord 2021, everyone should know that the US healthcare system is objectively terrible. It would make a whole lot more sense to do what all the other wealthy countries do and implement a universal healthcare system. So what's it gonna cost? According to a Congressional Budget Office report, the most thorough and extensive of its kind, we need to consider not what it will cost to implement, but how much we'll save by implementing it. The report is incredibly comprehensive, and if you'd like to read it yourself, I've left a link in the description. But the bottom line is this. The report took 4 proposed universal healthcare plans and ran the numbers. They found that every single one of them would save us tens or hundreds of billions of dollars per year, ranging from $42 billion to $743 billion. Then, just to show the most extreme end of implementation costs, they developed a 5th hypothetical system, a program with high payment rates to providers and drug companies and low cost sharing for individuals, and added long-term support and services. Even under this unrealistic model, spending only increased by $290 billion per year, less than half of what we spend on death and destruction every year. Of course, no one is suggesting we implement this needlessly expensive approach. The model that most closely matches current Medicare for All proposals would yield $300 billion in annual savings. That sounds pretty good. At this point, the only people who are against universal healthcare are those who have been paid to spout private insurance propaganda and those who have taken their bait. Universal healthcare has strong bipartisan support. There are 0 benefits to private health insurance. The wait time argument is objectively false. We wait just as long for treatment as many countries with universal healthcare, plus we pay obscene amounts of money to do it. But just for the sake of this thought experiment, let's say we did adopt the unreasonably expensive model, the one that adds $290 billion to the annual cost of healthcare. If we take that number, plus the $20 billion for ending homelessness, we still haven't even reached 50% of what the Pentagon spends on war every single year. And we've solved 2 of the biggest challenges facing the American people. Now, all of this sounds great, but the politicians aren't just going to concede to common sense. They're invested, often quite literally, in the never-ending growth of the military. Part of the problem is the continued privatization of all aspects of modern life under capitalism. We now have fewer active military personnel than private contractors in the Middle East. We are addicted to outsourcing labor to the private sector, often with disastrous consequences. One of those consequences is that the Department of Defense will face years of litigation and hundreds of millions of dollars in settlements if they attempt to pull American operatives out of Afghanistan. Why? because the US had signed an agreement to fully withdraw from Afghanistan by May 1st of 2021. But there are still thousands of active contractors in that country with contracts that don't expire until well after the withdrawal deadline. If the US pulls them out before their contracts expire, the Pentagon would face tremendous backlash from these private groups. The Pentagon put themselves in this situation. Many of those contracts were signed after the withdrawal deadline was established. Of course, that's only one minor symptom, but it's indicative of the larger disease. We've allowed capitalism so much free rein that the federal government itself, along with the most powerful military in the world, is completely beholden to the private sector. Free market evangelists call for more military funding, which is then siphoned off into the bank accounts of private contractors, who then hold the government hostage for more funding, and on in a vicious cycle, enriching private interests and fueling the cancerous growth of the military-industrial complex. This year's defense budget will be over $700 billion. After all the little extra expenses and pet projects are tacked on, that number will be closer to $750 billion. According to the media and government officials, our largest supposed threats are China and Russia. Again, if we cut our military budget in half, we would still spend $100 billion more than China. We'd spend $300 billion more than Russia. At what point do we say enough is enough? Let's spend that money fixing problems at home, not making more problems abroad. Martin Luther King Jr. once said that the United States is the greatest exporter of violence in the world. That statement has never been more true. Every year it becomes clearer that the US military is not a force for good or for freedom, but a force for chaos and oppression of people you and I will never meet. People who are just like us, and who do not deserve to be brutalized by a country who fancies itself the world's police force. We need to divest from the military and invest in critical projects right here at home. Healthcare, ending homelessness and poverty, providing free education to our students, and making this country the nation it claims to be. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that this type of content is made possible by my patrons on Patreon. This kind of video, while very important, is something that sponsors won't touch. To keep my channel running, I rely on sponsors, AdSense, and donations from generous viewers. By producing explicitly anti-capitalist content, I lose out on both sponsors and AdSense. If you'd like to help me produce more content like this, and you're able to chip in even $1 a month, I would greatly appreciate the support. You can find my Patreon page, get early access to every video, and join our growing Discord server at patreon.com/secondthought. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my previous videos by clicking the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.